Thank you all for not drifting away after lunch.
Not yet, anyway.
Not yet, anyway, right? You know, talking about data can either be scary or boring or exciting, depending on where you're coming from it. So, I'm Kate Haley-Goldman.
Where are you from?
Where are you from, Kate?
I'm from HG&Co, and we are all have similar backgrounds, I would say, here.
I'm Ely Wood. I am from the Huntington Library, Botanical Gardens, and Art Museum.
The is very
It's a lot
important.
of things
That's
at
right,
once.
it's a lot of things.
And I'm Kathy Sigmund. I'm from RKNA, which is a research and evaluation firm.
So the genesis of this session was around data, obviously, but for us, I think, for me particularly, there's a large amount of exhilaration around how we're talking about data currently. Right? When I first started coming to MCN, we never talked about visitor data. We never talked about visitors, to be frank. That MCN was really about the back of the house and how we dealt with the technology in the back of the house, how we talked about collections, how we talked about metadata we would use, and how Dublin Core and a wide variety of things, but there was no audience within that. And in the 15, 18 years since I had that first experience with MCN, this organization, these topics have changed so much, right? In every session I go to, there is discussion of visitors and of audience and thinking about people's needs and thinking about data and what we know about our institutions, whether it's from the interactives on the floor to the people coming through the door. And so that's exciting. It's really exciting for all of us within that. It's also a little terrifying. And that's sort of that double-edged sword is the genesis of this conversation. And I think we have a shared worldview in thinking about data, but we know that we're not the majority within this. So ideas about data and where that comes from is very different when you're coming from different perspectives. And I'm not even talking cultural perspectives, types of institutions, et cetera, but in the critical thinking lens that you use when you're coming towards data. Right? And so we've heard us as a field start to slip towards jargon in the way we talk about data. Well, we have data, right? And so then we have answers, right? And for us, there's a large missing gap within this. And so, and we encounter it every day within our work, depending on where you go through. And we could give a long, dry piece on here's how you start the study and here's where you define within that. And we decided that while we're very capable of doing that, that we would instead like to focus on the situations that we find ourselves in regularly, and that we expect that you might find yourself in. And if we were sitting with you, what are the ways that we would navigate out of this situation? You're not at the point, perhaps, of starting a study. You've got something, and you're trying to figure out what to do with it. So, as a field, we'd like to up our game in terms of how we deal with the data. We'd like to deal with it more ethically, more rigorously, more thoughtfully, and
Wave your finger on
for us, we're going to start with talking about how to deal with it a little bit more thoughtfully.
Yeah. And I think just one point of clarification, because I know there have already been some really awesome sessions just today alone on data.
Yep.
This morning's plenary was on data governance and data ethics, and we are thinking in this room right now primarily about data generated from visitors. So that's the lens that we're going to
Research.
Yes, research on visitors. So data related to how visitors experience whatever in your museums.
And that could range from attendance data to back end of interactives to membership data to some extent in those pieces, but less so on metadata from collections, although some of the same principles apply.
Yeah.
Okay. We introduced us. So we're going to give you 6 situations that we have, and we're going to start in situation 1.
We're going to start with situation 1. This is real life. People were harmed to some extent. in the situation at hand, but not physically. That's just. So the first situation is that you may enter into an institution that doesn't really understand why it needs to collect data in the first place. And so, story to tell, I arrived at an institution with the mission to develop a web-based curriculum for teachers on American history and art. And I said, well, what do you know? Why do people want this? What do you know? And I got crickets and looks like, why would we do that? And as an educator, my first thought is, well, because if we want people to use it, we should figure out how and why they want to use it. And if anyone was in the room earlier on the Museums for Digital Learning initiative this morning, it was super cool because I was like, look, they asked what people want. So when we think about where's your institution at in terms of wanting to know why you're doing something, why you need help with this, that's the first place. So if you are at level 0, you might want to move up a level in terms of being able to say, why do we need this? What do we want to see happening? Why does this matter? What do we need help with? What do we want to do? Where can we take this? So that's sort of jump 1, is actually having a reason to collect and an interest in collecting data. It's actually very helpful. Do you want to add anything?
I would say that small doses of data are catnip, but the big doses of data are overwhelming, right? And so that when I'm trying to get an organization interested in those pieces, I'm very carefully and narrowly, regularly introducing small pieces of consumable popcorn data for leadership, right? And that we slowly move towards this, things that don't take me a long time to produce in order to generate further interest.
Yeah. And I think sometimes like a lack of interest in collecting data often stems from just worrying potentially about how much time and resources it's going to take, and not an actual lack of it's not actually that you don't want answers to the questions you have. So I almost feel like in this situation, if you ever find yourself in it or have, or just do in the future, what can be a good starting point is, dropping the word data out of the conversation and just starting to talk to your colleagues or your higher ups about what their questions are about where they're struggling in their work, or maybe don't use that word, but just probe them and start to ask them questions about, what are your big questions about how we're moving forward as an institution, either holistically in your department, and what do you feel like you need to know to, or would be really nice to know to help us move forward, and from there, propose collecting data to help solve that problem or to help inch you forward.
Because we're not advocating collecting it for just collecting it, because there's no point in collecting things you're not going to use.
Well, and when I say popcorn data, I mean someone else's. Did you see this fabulous study
Oh,
on this?
we promised we were not going to get war stories going. Next one. Okay, so situation number 2, you have some data lying around, but you have no idea how good it is or how useful it is. Again, true story. People were harmed in this, but not physically. We had a conversation. We said, gosh, it would be really great if we knew how many people came to said event that had a ticket ahead of time and how many people didn't come. And someone said, well, we have all that data. And someone else said, great, send it to me. And guess what I got? I got 60,000 data points, and none of it was useful. That was a very painful process to go through. So one of the problems that we have is we collect these things, we don't know why we're going to use it, we get it from somewhere else, and then we get it, and we don't know what to do with it because it's just numbers, and it's just info, and it's just stuff. It doesn't actually tell us anything, and that's one of the other problems that we have to think about, is how do we actually know how to see what's here, how to understand what it means, and getting to meaning is a long process that we tend to forget as part of what data actually represents. So as we think about it, what is it that we need? What could we change? What is it that we need to actually fix? A lot of data requires cleaning before it's even useful to use. So taking my 50,000 data points, I could narrow it down. Maybe I got 1,000 that were useful. And what does that mean to me? It's still only useful if I have a way to answer the question that I had. Oftentimes we're also collecting data for a question that we don't actually have, or we're not thinking about what we will use with it, or using somebody else's data to answer a different question, which is also a problem because we don't know how or why they started that information to collect. So is it reliable?
Yeah.
How do
and
we
I-
know reliable things are for our own purposes?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, if you find yourself in a position where you have someone else's old report, or, maybe it's not literally in a report format, but you've got data in some format that's, a little old and you weren't around when it was collected, but you're being given it and told to use it to move forward. I mean, think about, within what you've got, like, really be critical when you look at it. In what context was this data collected? You might not have all the answers, but see what you can discern from what you've got in front of you. And does that context in which that data was collected, so do all the same conditions exist in your institution now? And if everything has really changed a lot since that was done, maybe it's not something that's that useful for you. And it's okay to realize that and to say that. Yeah,
Go on.
sure.
Okay.
Oh, I guess that's me. Okay. So this is probably a situation that most of us have found, most of us have found ourselves in at one point or another. So you have an actual project and you want to collect data from visitors to answer a question or a set of questions. And really those questions that you want to answer, of course, revolve around how well is this working? They're all different versions of that. So this is where the need for a very rigorous approach comes in. So from a social science background, we might call this like an evaluation plan, which is a term you've heard, but whether you might have heard or not, but whether or not you want to think about it like using that framework exactly, really the most important thing to remember is to spend time planning. So, and to spend time planning, think really critically about what exactly you want to know and why you want to know it. So the first step is really like self-reflection on what are those questions that you want to answer. So what are those questions you have about visitors' experiences? Articulate them and make sure they're airtight. So I don't literally mean the questions that you're going to actually go out and ask visitors. I mean the questions that are framing why you're collecting data or what you're collecting data on in the first place. So making sure that those are really airtight questions, can actually be answered in the situation you have around you is really important. And those questions initially are going to be the gauge by which you measure the success when you're getting to the point of analysis and looking at the data. And another thing, when we talk about rigor and actually going out and collecting data, we often think, and in the social sciences, we talk about triangulating data, which is a fancy way of just saying having data coming in from multiple sources. So it's basically like looking at a phenomenon. So what is happening with visitors on our website, on this website, or visitors' experiences with this app, or visitors' experiences in this program, or visiting this exhibition, and what are the different ways we could collect data on that experience to answer that question. So we might collect data in some kind of quantitative way through a survey. We might look at analytics, but we might also find qualitative ways to gather data on visitors' experiences through observations, through interviews, and all of this using multiple methods is what we call triangulation, and it's the strongest way to build a reliable study, data that you actually can use because you've thought critically about what collecting data in different ways will tell you about the visitor experience. They'll tell you different things. And so as much as possible when you're seeking to go out and collect data, it's great if you have one source of data, but push yourself to think, is there another way I could look at this? And that is a really big part of approaching things rigorously. And feeling later on, even a few years down the road, that holds. That's something reliable that I can look back to and keep using for a while moving forward. And then, yeah, anything? You're giving me a look.
If you're done with this, I'll wait till you're done with this.
Yeah, and even another thing to think about when you are collecting data to answer these big questions you have about visitors' experiences, you want to think also about how you're going to approach dealing with that data once you've got it in your hands. Because it's one thing to collect it, but Kate and I talk about this all the time about how much time analysis really takes. And it's way longer than most people think. And we get that it's not all of your jobs necessarily to analyze data. You might never want to do that. But the point is more to understand that it really takes a long time. Iliad mentions data cleaning, which is something that we survey data, for example, it comes back and it's a lot messier than you think it's going to be, and it just takes a lot of time to sift through that and deal with the messiness before you can even get to a point of beginning to analyze what it's telling you, and then what it means for you and your work moving forward. And all of this is a lengthy process. So as excited as you might be to actually have the data in your hands, the point I really want to leave you all with is just making sure that you understand that analysis is a huge part of the equation and is not something to be rushed.
Yeah, I'd say that I think, and some of you have heard me say this before, that I would say 90% of the time that I've had a project go off the rails is because there was not enough time spent in the planning for the study, the program, the whatever else it was, right? It's just that we did not spend significant time within that, and that the actual collecting of the data is for us, is the smallest part of any piece. And so when people tell me that this can be automated, yeah, some of that can be automated, the collection of the data. But we spend, 3 days for every day that you're conducting interviews, bare minimum, right? And that doesn't even get you to the next in terms of cleaning that and analyzing that. And I think for me, it was that part of the fear in when I was talking about how exhilarating this moment is, where we're becoming a data-rich society, is that data by itself is nothing. It's absolutely nothing, right? So the data that doesn't tell the story, and saying, I get tweets and I get emails full of, we have data. Okay?
Yeah.
So then what? And that in our mind, from a social science perspective, even after you've gone through that data, that the analysis and interpretation are two different phases, right? And so analysis is really summing that data, running statistical tests on that data, maybe taking all the keywords from your interviews and looking at the trends, right, whether this is qualitative. Interpretation is something different. Interpretation is when you start to generate meaning. And that, in my view, cannot be automated. That's the richness that we have as a field, as a profession, bringing our experience to that analysis and understanding whether it's important or not. So, getting to that very first step of having information is great. We as a society have an enormous amount of information right now. We are lacking in meaning. So the next step in developing that is not simply developing skills on how to handle data, but how to think about data critically. That's really about the thinking skills and applying that. And I would love to see that developed up in our field as the next part of this wave of information we're having.
Yeah.
That's a good segue to the next slide.
Sure. Okay, so situation 4, you don't really have a specific question, but you need or want to understand your visitors and their experiences. So you're not sure exactly what you want to focus on, but you are hungry for more information.
Because collecting data is going to get you an answer.
Yeah, you're excited about data, and that's super awesome. It's a good starting point to be in, but can definitely be overwhelming. And I think that the best way to approach this kind of a situation is really to just try to back up and to almost tame that excitement about collecting data for a moment and ask, why collect data now, right? What is really driving your desire to answer questions or to find out more about visitors' experiences now? And if this is a demand that's coming from your higher ups or your colleagues, like maybe you're excited too, but you're told, we don't know anything about visitors, right? Like we need to find out things, so please go find things out. I'm sure that's happened to more than one person in this room. And even, working as researchers, we sometimes get those kinds of requests from, potential clients and just people who want to know. And I think that's so great. But really, the first thing that we do is we ask a lot of questions. So if someone is coming to you and saying, we need to find out more, we really do a lot of probing. And we say, well, why now? Why is this itch there? And just get people talking about, what it is that's really driving their interest in finding out more about visitors. There's probably a lot to unpack there. And it probably does actually, people probably do have a really specific question. Or if it's just coming from you, check yourself. Do you really not have a specific question? I actually kind of doubt that that's ever the case. I think it's awesome. Like, I love data, right? I love finding out as much as we can. But, there's definitely times when it's like you always, there's always something driving your interest to find out more, right? And it's just asking yourself why. Well, why is that important? Okay, I want to know this. Well, why is that important to know? And sort of going through that process, either with yourself or with the people who are demanding that you collect data or asking you to collect data, is really the first step in navigating this situation.
I think I often walk into a situation where we need to know more about our visitors. It's coming from on high, and the person that's talking to me does not have any authority necessarily to go up to the CEO and say, why do we need to know more about our visitors, right? And so then we're put in the position of not having any idea what that is for, and crafting something bad, right? Some sort of garbage in, garbage out, where we're not actually getting at the true need. And then the higher ups are frustrated, and we've spent a lot of time and energy going into circles. And so we work on different ways to talk about that process and their constraints without sounding challenging, right? So, I had situations where it's one thing to query yourself and say, why do I want to know this? It's another thing to go to your Uber boss and say, why do you want to know, right? Like, what is up with that, right? And so this discussion about, like, why now and other sorts of pieces is ways to ask softer questions that help surface the underlying piece. So it may be something like, is there a particular event or report or meeting that is coming up that shows this need at the moment? Who is going to be reading the results of this? Is this a donor? Is this a board member? And these are softer questions that put you in the position of being a good person in trying to find out more about what you've been tasked at. But really what you're trying to do is to suss out that motivation, right? Because the difference between find out more about our visitors for a specific donor is very different. And you would think that that was very basic, but the times that we are given this charge without the context is more often than with the context.
Yeah.
And so the more questions that you can ask that are not necessarily challenging but contextualizing will hopefully eventually surface what the true need is.
Yeah.
This is me. So I think this happens to a lot of people. Maybe not. Maybe has anyone else come across? I'll have to show of hands.
Yeah, raise your hand.
Where
I'm
it
sure.
could be your institution.
And I just want to say, we also regularly have to look at other people's studies and be like, what do we think of this too? So we're with you.
Right, and so we need to think about how to educate ourselves so that you don't necessarily want to be able to do scientific reading on this, right? But you need to make the call. Is this something that I want to pass out to my team? Or is this kind of sketchy and we really don't have an idea that these are true findings, right? That this was based on some sort of biased sample size in an institution that's not like mine. And so there are tells, of course, right, with any of these sorts of pieces. And if you're quickly going through things, you're not sitting there saying, well, I don't know if the effect size is large enough, right? Because I know you're not doing that, because I'm not doing that when I'm scanning these to go forward in these pieces. Some of the scientists on our team might be, but I'm not going to be doing that on my first pass. I'm going to be looking for the tells, right? And so, actually, Kathy brought this up. We were going back and forth and different, so I'm stealing her quote.
I stole it too.
Which is, yes, right, from the canon. And my tell is, Ginny, said Mr. Weasley, flabbergasted. Haven't I taught you anything? What have I always told you? Never trust anything that can think for itself if you can't see where it keeps its brain. Right? And so a good study is going to articulate the workings of its brain on the face of it, even if it's a blog post, even if it is something that you're seeing in a clipping. And that one of the more obvious pieces of that is they're going to list what the biases of the study were, right? So every reputable study that's put out there at some place should be able to talk about what the biases were in the collection, in the analysis, and the interpretation of that data, especially within the sampling. and the frames. And that's separate from the methodologies, right? That's not just in a straight piece.
You might also see them as limitations.
Right.
Because bias sometimes gets a weird nowadays.
Bias is a type of
It's
limitation.
It's a limitation
Right.
or things that
Caveats.
we couldn't do. We couldn't talk to all the teachers in the world.
Yeah,
So therefore, this is not about all teachers everywhere. This is not about
Right.
museums outside of the United States.
yeah,
Whatever you might think.
And I think when Kate says it's separate from methodology, what you mean is when we think about methodology, that's just literally describing what you did. So how did you collect the data? We did interviews with X people from this time period, and starting then, ending then. In this context, we were here, located here, and here is exactly how we recruited the people. And here's our interview guide, the questions that we asked, or at least the questions we started with. It's the what you did, but it's not a broader framework of situating that process of what you did. That's what the limitations will add. It'll layer on top sort of surrounding context that is missed if you just list what you did.
So if you're not seeing that, up front, then you're going to have to go through and figure out what the biases are. And you may or may not be buried within that report. But already, that whoever has written that is not being transparent about what is there. And I think as a culture, our culture is very guilty of this, and we would like to advance something that is much more about transparency of the data, and not just how it was gathered, but how it was analyzed, what lenses or frameworks were used for that, and then how it was interpreted. So our workshop that we were in just before lunch was really talking about one of the benefits of some of the newer ways of analyzing data is that you can have these tracks, you can have this transparency to be able to show it with other folks. You should see that in the way that people are talking about their work in the paper, and that should give you confidence to be able to share it with your colleagues.
Yeah, and every study has limitations. No study is without limitations, and so seeing a limitations section or a section that describes bias in some way in a study is actually not a marker of a poor study. It's actually a marker of a really strong study because it means that the people who conducted it thought very critically about what they were doing and what they were not doing. So they were as rigorous as possible about what they did do, but they acknowledged that they could not possibly and will never be able to possibly look at everything.
Good point.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is that if you are not statistically inclined and you start reading things that start to make your eyes go crazy, that it's okay if you don't know it, but you should know enough to know when you don't know what you're looking at to decide how do you ask someone else for help. And that's part of that leveling up process is knowing where you're starting from. If you have some basic knowledge, what more can you do? How do you start to look further into understanding that? Even if it's just on a super basic level, you can still do more to learn how to read things and to be critical and question.
So the last one, and we went back and forth on whether this actually happens to people other than us. So I would love to, do people encounter evaluation plans in grant proposals, RFPs, panels that you may sit on, and you're asked to be voting on this project or give some sort of critical review, right? And this is not necessarily your expertise. It may be about how you're going to handle this, right? Sometimes it happens where you're looking for best practices, right? And you're trying to figure out where this is. Mostly what I am looking for when I'm examining this for, say, a grant panel for someone else is I'm looking for the clarity of critical thinking around the strategies that they develop, right? Sometimes look at the sample size, but that's not the first or even the 10th thing that's important to me, right? If they haven't listed it there, then that may be a little odd, but really, it's about the clarity of thinking of their questions as aligned to the project. And I think for me, it's like an intellectual puzzle, which is why I enjoy what I do. Does this strategy appropriately address what the project is doing? And I think that we can all slowly get better about that. Does gathering this kind of data really represent well what we're trying to say? And so most of the time, when people are writing grants, they have limited space, right? And so if I was writing a plan for these folks, it certainly wouldn't be a half of a page, right? I'm cutting out a lot to write something for a grant. But nonetheless, you should be able to see that alignment through the programs, and a rationale of why the strategies that they are proposing solve that question. If you see strategies with no rationale, then you're not able to see the brain behind that, right?
Why you're collecting data.
Why they're collecting data in that way. And so often I see we're going to do a couple of focus groups, because everyone loves to call everything focus groups, and then we're going to do an online survey, and then we're going to do this, and there is no why in that.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at that and you're saying either they're thinking I'm not smart enough to know that these things are all different, or they haven't thought it through, and they're sort of throwing ingredients together to make a plan to move it out, right? And that's not where we want to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think, take this term evaluation plan with a grain of salt. You might find yourself sort of reviewing it in the context of a grant like Kate was discussing, but I think really what this point is about is someone presents you with a strategy for collecting data. That's all the evaluation plan is. It's a plan for collecting data, how you'll go about it, and why you are going to do it. So you might be presented with that in a much less formal way. Your colleague comes to you saying, hey, we want to find out more about X in our museum. We're going to go about it this way. And that's the evaluation plan, right, that they're presenting you with. So thinking really critically about why did they develop that strategy for collecting data, and is that really going to answer the actual questions that you have? Is it, are you just looking to data sources that are easy for you to gather versus what might actually be best? Are you triangulating data like we talked about earlier? So asking these critical questions about the strategy that is proposed in whatever format you receive it.
I always like the shorthand. What's your question? What information do you need to answer that question? How are you going to get it? And how do you know that's going to help you answer your question? So as long as you have those put together, you've got something.
And I, of course, think of it as a cooking analogy, which is I wouldn't serve my CEO raw ingredients. And I would not put raw ingredients into a plan and assume that you understand that I'm going to make a lasagna from it, right? That this is not happening. But when you have data or just methods without rationale, you haven't done any of the cooking of that, which is the analysis and the interpretation. It does not become a meal until you have done that. And that in the planning stage is about the strategy, and that in the finished stage is about the interpretation.
Yeah. Good.
So we are getting close to discussion. So our manifesto.
Change that slide. She's got lots of computers
I get
right
lots
now.
of computers going. So if we had a manifesto or takeaways, it is really about data literacy. And we do want to define data literacy from our point of view, what that means. We think as a field that MCN can be this place where we're conversant around this process, right? And all of the stages within it. And that should be a goal for us personally and for something to model within our teams, right? And that comes within a stage-by-stage moment.
I think from my perspective, it is about knowing where you're starting from and where you want to get to next. So you don't have to go from 0 to 100. You can go from 0 to 1 in one area, and maybe someplace else you have more developed capacity or knowledge, and that's okay. It's really just about continuing to look at where you're at, how you can get further along in your knowledge base so that you become conversant. It's in the same way that you really hope that you go into a meeting with an educator who's like, but what do the people want? That they actually understand a few things about the technological components or the strategies or those types of things. We all need to be more conversant in so many different types of work that we're doing in an interdisciplinary kind of world, that this is the same, it's sort of the give and take part of it. So if you are a gamer, you might think about it as when you level up, you get some new powers, you get some new access to things, but you're not quite there yet. You really want to get to that next thing, but you have to keep working at it. And I think that's the message that we're kind of looking at here, is that you really have to practice where you want to get to and find the way to develop your skill set.
If you want to go through the
Yeah, well, we've done some of that.
Yeah, I think she touched on a lot.
Yeah. So one of the things that we were talking about is I think people feel insecure in the portions around it that are not just the collecting of data, right? And so it is, I don't know, right? I don't know statistics. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how to frame the right questions within that. And I would say that this group is particularly well situated for a more agile approach to data literacy in terms of a more iterative approach to data literacy in terms of those things. So each study, each piece that we have, each time we're doing the Google Analytics, each time becoming a little more conversant within that allows us to move forward. Each of us regularly can look back on studies that we have done in the years past and see that sort of progression, right? You should be able to see that your work gets better over time. And that with those pieces, I think that with those pieces as well.
Yeah, and I think that another point to make, just thinking about becoming what we call data literate, really conversant in how to deal with data, how to talk about data, how it's collected, how to plan for collecting data, and what you do with it after you've got it. It's not about necessarily, it's a little bit about slowing down, but it's not about slowing down to the point of not collecting data or not moving forward. There's a lot of really amazing rapid iteration that happens on designs or products or programs or whatever your bread and butter is, your work is. There's something to be said about moving, in a very iterative and quick way. And this thinking really critically about data doesn't impede that, right? So you can apply this rigorous thinking, this critical lens of, is this really the right strategy to collecting data in any situation? And it shouldn't preclude you from, doing a lot of rapid prototyping, let's say. I do a lot of work with what I call formative evaluation or front-end evaluation for exhibitions, for media that goes in exhibitions, but just for text that gets written for exhibitions and really anything that could find itself in that kind of space. And I know we've all been there as well. And that kind of stuff, happens, you test different versions over and over. But when we do those kind of studies, and we do call them studies, there's a rigor to how we've decided to test each one of those pieces out, even if we're swapping out versions, every couple of days based on what we learn. There's always a rationale for why we've decided to do focused observations plus interviews with this amount of people because we're trying to answer these questions, and we think that's the best way to get there. There's always a rationale. And so I do want to stress that it doesn't mean, we're not advocating spend so much time doing all of the planning that you never move forward in actually doing the work. That's not really what being data literate is. I mean, we do love to sit down and hunker down with a good study, but that's why we are researchers, But yeah, I just want to stress that it doesn't, when I think about being a data literate person, I certainly don't think about that as, as stopping all of the amazing rapid prototyping and testing work that happens in the tech space.
And we hope that the field will slowly move towards impact and looking at impact of the work we do. So I think that that's where we as a group really lag in thinking about we spend a lot of time crafting audience needs and motivations around the products, programs, and exhibitions we develop, and we spend very little time thinking about was that successful in a deep and meaningful way with our visitors afterwards. Right. And so hopefully as we get through this practice, we can do that a little bit more.
Right. I think in some really basic kinds of questions that we used to work with in a different place was, what's working and why, and what are people doing with it as a result? As a basic question that was worth collecting data on. What are people actually doing with this, and where do they take it? And why does that matter to what we meant in the first place?
Yeah, and I think also the way that we think about impact is impact on your visitors, because they're who your institutions serve first and foremost. And so, your mission, what you do is, your mission is what you do, but your impact is the result of what you do on people. So thinking really clearly, and that can be applied for your whole institution, but you can also, think about what that is and articulate it for one phenomenon, right? For one app, for one website, for one whatever. What do you hope the result of what you do What do you hope what you do? Like, what's the intended result on people? What are they going to take away from it? What do you want them to take away? And starting with that, and then backtracking to all the rest of what we've been talking about, okay, so what does that mean for the way in which I will collect data and how I will analyze the data and how I will interpret it moving forward?
It takes practice, right?
Yeah.
And so, like making a lasagna, it takes practice in terms of these pieces. So, with my teams, we've worked on exercises in monthly data pieces, and we will get out something and say, okay, everyone's going to sit with this, and tomorrow at lunch, we're going to talk about what each of us thought it meant. So we're going to practice the interpretation part of this. We've got a little bit of this. We've taken it from someone's study. We've gotten it. Informalscience.org is full of studies. There are other places to get them. And whether it's, we often alternate between our own study, and so how we can prove our own work, and then someone else's study, right? And say, and it's fascinating how we can sit around a table and come to completely different conclusions based on the same paper there as we're trying to pull those ideas through, right? And that sort of learning how to analyze and interpret, that portion of it is done in conversation with your peers. And in our current emphasis over data, we haven't made any space for that growing portion of learning how to interpret. And that's something that we all practice all the time, that we practice, right? And so that's not something that we would expect that people who are not researchers are doing. But you'd have to make space for it every once in a while to become data literate. I find it fun, but
Yeah.
the piece.
So I think now's time for questions.
Now's the time for questions.
Discussion.
You know this was
Feedback. Crickets.
Crickets.
Yeah, she's got it. We should.
Oh, no.
You asked a big question.
What are you
Heather.
trying?
Are you ready?
She's poking at me.
What are you trying to impact?
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Let's see, okay, well, let's say that we want our collections to, I don't know, we have this qualitative goal about inspiring curiosity in our
Yes. How will we know?
How do we know we have done that?
Right?
What is a good way
Right?
to collect data about that?
Well, it comes back to a question is, what does it mean to be curious? How do we know
We push
curious
you to
when we
define
see
that
it?
more first.
We have
Yeah.
to define, and I think that's the reason why we keep asking those questions is, well, what do you mean by that? What does curious mean? How do you know someone is inspired to curiosity? If we can break it down a little bit, then we might actually then be able to say, okay, I don't know, I'm going to go off the top of my head. Curiosity looks like someone who takes one idea and applies it to something else and wants to take that idea and go farther and deeper and read 10 books about it. So what does that mean we need to know? Well, then we actually have to find out what ideas got you excited and what did you do with those ideas when you were done with them? Then
Part
we
of-
have to figure out where does that data come from?
Yeah,
Many places.
Part of it is, and what Eli's saying is part of it is a process of articulating really what you mean by that first, and then thinking about, okay, well, so we know we've articulated what we want to achieve, what we want for visitors. How might that show up? Like, in an ideal world, like, what might manifest? So what might we hear people saying, see people doing, or what actions, what might we see them, what will we see to let us know that that's happened? And from there, and being really clear, and that may be many different things. It should be many different things, again, from many different angles. And then you back up and you say, all right, well, what data collection methods do we need to employ to find out whether or not those things happened, and go from there. So it's, when we talked at the beginning about how it's so much about planning, and again, it doesn't have to happen super slowly to the point where things never get done, but that planning phase is so important, really articulating what you mean, and thinking about what you
So
actually
can
might see.
Plan for it in the process instead of doing it at the end when you could. Then you realize, oh gosh, we could have figured out some of these things if we had planned for them at the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, the classic question is, what do visitors know, think, feel, do, believe differently because they've seen your exhibition in that?
Right.
And so if that is inspiring curiosity, then that is what they're talking about. A classic, many of you are from this community, right? The classic markers in museum learning is that it takes time to manifest, and that it often manifests in through conversation with others, right? So we spend an inordinate amount of time interested in how people talk to others and what they talk to them about. But for that particularly, you could manifest curiosity in Wikipedia searches, right? And so like there is some very concrete pieces around that that you may or may not want to define, and that can be some rough and tumble going out to the visitors and being like, so just talk to us about, what did you find engaging, and developing your metrics from there, right? Because Wikipedia sounds like a much more approachable question than inspiring curiosity, but to many people they seem the same thing, right? Like, so, there you go.
Yeah, can I just,
Yeah.
so my name is Mitch
You might
Solomon
want the
with
mic.
the Museum of Life and Science.
Did you want
And,
this?
And we're tackling something very similar to that. So our top level strategic objective is to nurture critical thinking. So we went through a process with lots of people to codify that and to codify, to define what for us that means these 8 dimensions. And we've started a process of trying to evaluate for that on the floor through observation, which primarily means for each one of those dimensions, we say, well, what might that look like? What would curiosity look like on the floor? What would asking good questions look like? What would analyzing data look like? And then and then we observe for that. So that's kind of that's our baby step into the process. So I'm just curious who asked the question, because I would love
Heather.
to connect more with you later on. The Discovery Place in Charlotte has been also trying to tackle this, I think, around the concept of wonder for the past few years, and has been doing some really interesting work around that as well. So we'll
Wonder.
connect.
I mean, I think it's also another thing is like
Thank you.
inspiring like long term, like it might not happen in the
Right.
Yeah.
And, well, and there's
So,
a
in the-
lot of research to back that up.
Yeah. Well, so part of part of it is just knowing that, right? Like, you're a museum and you cannot do a longitudinal study of people throughout their lives. You can't.
You can, but you really probably don't want to.
You probably don't have the resources.
Probably can't
though.
afford
You probably
to.
don't
Can't
want
afford
to.
it, and nobody will stay.
Yeah, and I mean, so in the evaluation world, we talk about short-term outcomes versus long-term outcomes, long-term impacts. And so part of your planning up front is articulating, what might you see, but when might you see it? And knowing that there are some things that you won't necessarily be able to observe, like manifest, because they'll happen months later, or they'll happen, months later you can potentially contact someone, but they'll happen years later, let's say, right? Just far after the study is concluded. And so acknowledging what those things are, but also thinking critically about, well, what might be the inklings that is starting to happen, because those things will happen in the shorter term, and that's what you're able to see.
I mean, I wouldn't discourage you from doing that, right? There are a number of good studies going on about wonder. There are, I've done studies on awe. And
awe and wonder.
they're, right? And so
Particularly
they're-
in the art museum space.
Right,
Yeah, there's a lot.
right, and those sorts of pieces, and so because it's emotional or mushy like that, doesn't mean that it isn't an impact that we're looking for, and one that we could seek out.
Yeah.
We won't get into the nuances of different types of research, but some ways of collecting information are better for certain types of concepts like that
Yeah.
than others.
Definitely. And I think one thing to think about too is, like, with big concepts like curiosity, wonder, awe, even things that are so seemingly nebulous can actually be very rigorously broken down into things that you might see. It takes a lot of time to get there, but
does.
you really can actually articulate, maybe it's 10 different ways you might see that manifest that together, like collectively, translate into awe, translate into wonder. Some of those things you might see right away, some might be later, and they all build on one another. But you actually can, like, push yourself to really articulate what you mean and what you might see. Because it's gonna go a long way in terms of collecting valuable data for moving you forward. There's a couple others.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I kind of
Do you want to be the mic person?
kind of like the beginning.
Hold on. Mic.
I can do that.
So it's kind of 2 parts, beginning and end, because I work in consultancy as well. And so the word, well, first of all, do you have any advice for these organizations here when they're writing an RFP and asking people to help them
Yeah.
with research and as part of the response they require an evaluation plan when no discussion has been had at all. And
I
then
love this
at
question.
the backside, at the end, when everything's said and done, this idea of conversant and how important speaking in plain English and the way you write your reports, like you were talking about methodology and limitations and things like that. Most of the time, people that I report to just want the executive summary. And you're like, but I went through all this trouble to.
Well, yeah, results are top of mind. I mean, that's why, you want the answers.
So yeah, I guess advice on that early bit when an organization's
Kate has thoughts.
sending out an RFP and
Well,
the
you-
end
and you could
when
go
you're
first. I want
writing the final stuff.
I mean, my personal take, and several of you heard me say this, is that our work coming from, applying a social science mindset to museums and to informal learning has changed more rapidly in the last 10 years than any of the museum technology that I see here at conferences, right? So I know that world and the technologist world has changed, but we have really changed and have a lot more change to do in how we report out useful, actionable pieces in plain English in visual reports, right? And that our field is changing through that. And the American Evaluation Association has one of the best professional organizations that I've ever come in contact with, right? With some of these, with placemat reports, with different ways to move forward in terms of this type of reporting. And we have seen it change through that. It is an issue in terms of being actionable from me, right? That I think that our reports have been too academic in that way and therefore frustrate the people that we work with as a field, my field.
Yeah. Well, and speaking to your first part of the question about like what can you practically put into an RFP or a request of some sort, I mean, I think that just a couple of really basic things that come to mind are like some sort of statement or description of how you anticipate using the data collected. So regardless of methods chosen, how you might use this in your work moving forward. Knowing that we know that might change like later on, but just at the time you're putting out the RFP, like put in a line or two about like how you would hope to use this, because that's like the first thing that we will ask when we get there. So it'd be nice to have a little bit of a heads up, and then something like some sort of statement or something just saying you want multiple methods. If you have any in particular in mind for a certain reason, that's good to know too. And then I think that one thing that is, like a lot of RFPs that I've seen have a tight timeline, and there's many reasons why that are a lot of out of your control, and we get that. But having heard us talk about how long the analysis and interpretation process takes, and it's much longer than data collection, understanding that and trying to build that into the timeline, or at least acknowledging that, you're going to give, at minimum, like equal time for data collection and data analysis. I don't know how exactly you'd write that up, but sort of thinking about those things as you're building the RFP it translates well into like how we would respond to it.
But I think the other key thing is that, because it goes back to the question of the hidden agenda, why is it that you are collecting evaluation data in the first place? What is it that you intend to do, or why are you doing it? It doesn't always have to be about impact, depending on what the purpose of the project is. It could very much be about, did the system of our new operating process to do a project work internally? So you can look at things on a lot of different levels, and it comes back to, why do you need to know it, and what are you going to do with it? And if it is because the grant requires it, if you go back and you look at why grant makers are requiring it, is often to be sure that you have got someone else helping you think about what you've done, so that you're not just making it up as you go. It's a checkpoint. It's sort of a way of balancing out, have you thought about all the pieces? So an advisory panel is just the same idea in a different strategy. What is the purpose of the evaluation? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it? Where do you take it next? Is it something to inform your process so that you learn and develop further and further? So I think those are the kinds of questions that you really want to be thinking about as you write that.
Kathy reminded me that the tight timeline piece, so the institutions that, my peers here included, the people that you're going to want to book are going to be booked much further out than often the RFPs allow. And so the smart institutions that we work with will call us and say, hi, I'm going to have an RFP in about 2 months. We're kind of thinking of going here. Just a heads up, right? And they'll do that. I know that they're calling various people to say that. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Let me think about that. I might go see your exhibition. I might see this sort of piece. So then the thinking process is happening so that the turnaround is better. In terms of that.
Doesn't always
Someone over here.
No. Carrie.
There's a mic.
The mic is, oh, look.
We're going to try to be good about using that.
We have a new friend sitting over.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carrie. I work at the American History Museum at Smithsonian, and I just wanted to chime in and say, yes, like an evaluative mindset is super important, and because we're museum technology people, we're already kind of in that mindset, and that we'll find a lot of willing partners in changing culture at our museums with museum educators, because a lot of museum educators are like already in this mind space and are like ready to go. So having tech savvy partners that can help them, get the data they need and will help us take action on it.
Yeah.
I'm in both camps, both a digital person and an educator. And a good resource that I have on my shelf as a museum educator is John Jacobson's book, Measuring Museum Impact and Performance, available on Amazon. I am not getting paid by him, but it's wonky.
Sponsored.
It's super wonky, right? But if you're looking for what is a metric I could use to measure joy, or there's all kinds of community impacts in there, so you might find that helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I love that call back to educators. I myself come originally, Ely and I both come originally from an education background, and I think that it's really, even if you are not an educator and don't plan to be one, but you work with them often or just want to understand that world more, a lot of research, so much of what museums do is promote learning in different ways, and we articulate what that means in our own spaces, great, but there's so much education research out there. That's a huge field to look to for rigorous research. It falls under that social science umbrella of what we were talking about. So thank you for that. But yeah, it's a great educational research.
We're going to have just a couple of closing comments, and then we're happy to answer questions afterwards. So in thinking about this, when I started at the Institute for Learning Innovation, and John Falk asked that I take over I create a technology evaluation portfolio for them. I was the only one in the institution doing it, but that I was very keenly aware that would go away, that all evaluators would be involved in technology, because the technology was going to be involved in everything, right? It wasn't this separate website anywhere else. And that's happening right now with data for all of us, right? Everyone in this room is that, I may be the person that analyzes data for a living, but you will all be involved in that in some way or another going forward. That's the way that our world is moving. And so figuring out how you want to be able to handle that is part of the coming piece that we're facing, right? Where we have a glut of data and a deficit of meaning.
Yeah, and that's why we call everyone to be call on everyone to be data literate. And I mean, even the sessions earlier this morning, the plenary panel was another version of that, just coming at it from a different side, right? But how important it is to know about what data is being collected, reasons why, where it's coming in, what to do with it. That's really all we ask for. Do you want to put our info up there
Put our
too?
info up.
Yeah.
Our info. I was just going to say, if you need a lesson in this, there's the useless maps meme is a really great way of using a starting point for you about thinking about, I don't know if anyone's seen, I don't have an example to show, but they're maps that are made of ridiculous information that's not very helpful. And I think if you can think about why does this matter and what does it mean for what I need to know, that's really the best place you could start with in terms of making your plan for how you can get to the next phase of your understanding, because it's everywhere and all of us need to know, because it affects our lives in ways that I think we are all aware of more than ever before. So being literate is not only good for your work, but also for yourself.
And you mentioned a good resource if anyone wants more specific resources of where do I look, just to look at other studies.
Yeah.
Just come talk to us after, and we're happy to tell you where to look.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much.
2:30 on the dot.